You have great ideas, but struggle to get people to listen and follow through on your vision. Every meeting feels like an uphill battle to get buy-in for even simple changes, while you watch less experienced managers command respect and inspire their teams to go above and beyond. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying what separates natural leaders from those who struggle to influence others, transforming my discoveries into principles that have guided millions. What I learned about developing your natural leadership abilities will give you the power to inspire genuine loyalty and commitment in any situation, using the same human psychology insights that turned shy, anxious people into confident leaders. The same principles that helped a stammering farm boy become one of America's most influential teachers can unlock the leadership potential that already exists within you. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to discover their natural leadership abilities. I grew up on a farm in Maryville, Missouri, where my father raised hogs, and my mother struggled to make ends meet. We were poor, but what troubled me more than our lack of money was my crippling shyness, and the way my voice would shake whenever I had to speak in front of others. At school, I would rather take a failing grade than stand up and give a recitation. The thought of speaking publicly made my hands sweat, and my heart raced so violently I was certain everyone could hear it pounding. My father was a practical man who believed in hard work and common sense, but he didn't understand my fear of speaking. "Dale," he would say, "you've got good ideas in that head of yours, but they're worthless if you can't share them with people." He was right, of course, but knowing that didn't make it any easier. I watched other young men in our community step naturally into leadership roles, organizing church events, running for local office, commanding respect when they spoke. I envied them deeply and wondered what mysterious quality they possessed that I lacked. The turning point came when I was 16. Our county was holding a speaking contest, and despite my terror, I decided to enter. I practiced my speech about Abraham Lincoln for weeks, pacing back and forth in our barn, rehearsing every word until I could recite it perfectly. But when the night arrived and I stood before that crowd of farmers and townspeople, something remarkable happened. As I began speaking about Lincoln's humble beginnings and rise to greatness, I forgot about my fear. I was so absorbed in my subject, so passionate about Lincoln's story, that my nervousness vanished. I didn't win the contest, but something far more valuable occurred. After my speech, old Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife who intimidated everyone in town, approached me with tears in her eyes. "Young man," she said, "you made me feel like I was right there with Lincoln as a boy. You have a gift for reaching people's hearts." That night, lying in bed, I realized something profound. Leadership wasn't about being born with some magical quality. It was about genuinely caring about your message and your audience. This realization changed everything for me. I began to notice that the people I admired as leaders weren't necessarily the loudest or most charismatic. They were the ones who showed genuine interest in others, who listened more than they spoke, who made people feel valued and important. I started practicing these behaviors, first with my family, then with neighbors, and eventually with strangers I met in town. When I left the farm to pursue my education and eventually found myself teaching at the YMCA in New York, I carried this foundational truth with me. Every person has natural leadership abilities waiting to be developed. My job wasn't to create leaders, it was to help people discover the leader that already existed within them. This understanding became the cornerstone of everything I would later teach about human relations and leadership development. When I first walked into that YMCA classroom in New York City, I was terrified. The year was 1912, and I had convinced the YMCA director to let me teach a course in public speaking, even though I had no formal training as an instructor. What I did have was a burning conviction that anyone could learn to speak with confidence and influence others. I just didn't know if I could actually teach it. My first class consisted of 12 businessmen who had paid $2 each to learn public speaking. They were salesmen, clerks, and small business owners, all struggling with the same fears I had battled as a young man on the farm. As they took their seats that first evening, I could see the anxiety in their eyes, the way they avoided making eye contact, the nervous fidgeting with papers and pencils. They reminded me so much of myself at 16. I had prepared a traditional curriculum based on the formal rhetoric I had studied in college, complete with rules about gesture, voice projection, and proper stance. But as I looked at these grown men who had worked all day and then dragged themselves to this classroom seeking help, I realized that academic theory wasn't what they needed. They needed something real, something that would work in their daily lives when they had to speak to customers, lead meetings, or present ideas to their bosses. So I threw out my carefully prepared lesson plan and did something radical. I asked each man to stand up and talk for 2 minutes about something that had made him angry. No rules, no formal structure, just speak from the heart about something that mattered to them. The transformation was immediate and astounding. Men who had been tongue-tied and nervous suddenly became animated, passionate, convincing. When Henry Blackstone talked about the incompetent contractor who had botched his home renovation, he spoke with such fire and clarity that everyone hung on every word. That night I witnessed something that would revolutionize my understanding of leadership and human potential. These men weren't lacking in leadership ability. They had simply never been given permission to be themselves. When they spoke about subjects they genuinely cared about, their natural leadership qualities emerged effortlessly. They didn't need to learn how to be leaders. They needed to learn how to release the leader that was already within them. The most profound moment came when James Morrison, a quiet bookkeeper who hadn't said a word all evening, stood up to talk about his passion for helping underprivileged children learn to read. As he described the joy on a child's face when they successfully sounded out their first sentence, Morrison transformed before our eyes. His voice grew strong, his posture straightened, and he spoke with such conviction that by the end, several men were asking how they could volunteer to help his literacy program. I realized that Morrison hadn't suddenly developed leadership skills. He had always possessed them. What happened was that he had found his authentic voice, the part of himself that genuinely cared about making a difference. And when people speak from that place of authentic caring, others naturally want to follow them. This revelation changed everything about how I approach teaching leadership. I stopped trying to mold people into some artificial idea of what a leader should look like and started helping them discover their own natural leadership style. The first and most fundamental principle of natural leadership became crystal clear to me through a man named Frank Betker, a struggling insurance salesman who attended my classes in Philadelphia. Frank was technically competent and knew his products inside and out, but he couldn't understand why his sales remained dismally low while other agents in his office consistently outsold him. He was frustrated, on the verge of quitting, and desperate for answers. During one of our sessions, I asked Frank to describe his typical sales approach. He explained how he would meet potential clients, immediately launch into his presentation about policy benefits and premium structures, handle objections with well-rehearsed responses, and then ask for the sale. Everything he described sounded textbook perfect, yet he was failing miserably. I suspected the problem wasn't in his technique, it was in his heart. I gave Frank what seemed like a simple assignment. For the next week, instead of trying to sell anything, his only job was to become genuinely interested in each person he met. Not interested in them as potential customers, but interested in them as human beings. I wanted him to learn their names, remember details about their families, discover their hopes and concerns, and find something about each person that he could sincerely appreciate. Frank looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, "I'm a salesman, not a social worker. How is chit-chat going to help me sell insurance?" I told him to trust me and try it for just 1 week. What happened next transformed not only Frank's career, but my understanding of what creates true leadership influence. Within that week, Frank's sales began to improve dramatically. But more importantly, something fundamental had shifted in how people responded to him. Clients began asking for him specifically, referring their friends to him, and treating him less like a salesman and more like a trusted advisor. What had changed wasn't his product knowledge or his sales techniques, it was his genuine concern for the people he served. I later learned that Frank had started keeping a small notebook where he recorded personal details about each client, their children's names, their hobbies, their business challenges, their personal goals. Before each meeting, he would review these notes and genuinely consider how he might help that particular person, regardless of whether they bought insurance from him. This shift from self-interest to genuine interest in others had made him magnetic. The breakthrough came when I realized that what Frank had discovered wasn't just a sales technique. It was the essence of leadership itself. People don't follow leaders because of their titles or their authority. They follow leaders because they believe those leaders genuinely care about them and their success. When people feel that you're truly interested in their welfare, their dreams, and their challenges, they naturally want to cooperate with you. I began teaching this principle to executives, managers, and supervisors. If you want to lead others effectively, you must develop a sincere interest in their lives beyond just their work performance. Learn their names and use them frequently. Remember details about their families. Ask about their goals and genuinely listen to their answers. Show appreciation for their efforts, not just the results. The most powerful leaders I've encountered throughout my career have been those who made others feel like the most important person in the room. They had developed the rare ability to focus completely on whoever they were speaking with, making that person feel heard, valued, and understood. This isn't manipulation or technique. It's the natural expression of someone who has learned to care about others' success as much as their own. I learned the power of listening from one of the most successful executives I ever met, a man named Charles Schwab, who ran Bethlehem Steel. What struck me about Schwab wasn't his ability to give orders or make speeches. It was his extraordinary capacity to listen. I watched him in meeting after meeting, and I noticed something remarkable. He rarely spoke first, and when he did speak, it was usually to ask a question or to reflect back what someone else had said. One particular incident opened my eyes to why this approach made him such an effective leader. A crisis had erupted at one of the steel plants. Production had fallen behind schedule, workers were frustrated, and tensions were running high. The plant manager was called into Schwab's office, expecting to be reprimanded or given a series of directives about how to fix the situation. Instead, Schwab leaned back in his chair and said, "Tell me what's happening down there." For the next 20 minutes, he listened without interrupting as the plant manager explained the complexities of the situation: supply chain delays, equipment malfunctions, workforce concerns, and pressure from customers. Schwab asked occasional clarifying questions, but mostly just listened with complete attention. By the end of that conversation, something extraordinary had happened. The plant manager had talked himself through to several solutions that he might never have discovered if Schwab had immediately started giving orders. More importantly, he left that office feeling supported and empowered, rather than criticized and micromanaged. The problems were resolved within days, not because Schwab had imposed solutions, but because he had created the space for the right solutions to emerge. This experience taught me that the act of listening itself is a form of leadership. When we truly listen to someone, we're communicating several powerful messages: that their thoughts matter, that their perspective is valuable, and that we trust their ability to contribute meaningfully to solutions. People respond to this kind of listening by rising to meet our expectations. I began experimenting with this principle in my own teaching and consulting work. Instead of rushing to provide answers when students or clients brought me problems, I learned to ask questions and listen carefully to their responses. I discovered that people often know more about their situations than they realize. They just need someone to help them think through their own insights. The transformation was remarkable. When I listened more and talked less, my students became more engaged and took greater ownership of their learning. Clients began implementing suggestions more enthusiastically because they felt like partners in developing solutions rather than passive recipients of advice. My relationships deepened because people felt heard and understood rather than lectured or judged. But listening as a leader requires more than just staying quiet while others talk. It means listening with the intent to understand, not just to respond. It means paying attention to not just the words people say, but the emotions behind those words. It means creating an environment where people feel safe to share their real thoughts and concerns, not just what they think you want to hear. I learned to listen for what people weren't saying as much as what they were saying. Often, the most important insights come from the hesitations, the uncertainties, the half-formed thoughts that people share when they feel truly heard. Great leaders develop the ability to listen between the lines and to ask the questions that help people articulate their deepest concerns and highest aspirations. The deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated, and I learned this lesson in the most humbling way possible. Early in my career, I was consulting with a manufacturing company where I met a janitor named William who worked the night shift. Most executives walked past William as if he were invisible, but something about his quiet dignity caught my attention. One evening, I stopped to talk with him and discovered that he had been with the company for over 20 years. As we talked, I learned that William had suggestions for improving efficiency that could save the company thousands of dollars. He had noticed patterns in how equipment broke down, ideas for better organizing the workspace, and insights about workflow that only someone with his experience could provide. But no one had ever asked for his input. He was just the janitor, not someone whose opinion mattered. I arranged for William to present his ideas to the management team. The transformation was extraordinary. When William spoke about his observations and recommendations, he carried himself with a pride and confidence I had never seen before. His ideas were not only implemented, but led to significant cost savings and productivity improvements. More importantly, William began to see himself differently, not as just a janitor, but as a valuable contributor to the organization's success. This experience taught me that every person carries within themselves a deep need to feel significant, to know that their existence matters and their contributions are valued. When we recognize this need and sincerely address it, we tap into the most powerful motivational force in human nature. People will go to extraordinary lengths for leaders who make them feel genuinely important and appreciated. I began developing what I called the appreciation inventory for the leaders I worked with. This meant training them to actively look for things they could sincerely appreciate about each person on their team. Not generic praise or empty flattery, but specific recognition of genuine contributions, efforts, and qualities. The key was that this appreciation had to be authentic. People can sense insincerity immediately, and false praise is worse than no praise at all. One manager I worked with, Martha Reynolds, revolutionized her department by implementing this principle. She made it her practice to find at least one thing each day that she could genuinely appreciate about each team member. She would notice when someone stayed late to help a colleague, when someone came up with a creative solution to a problem, or when someone showed patience with a difficult customer. Most importantly, she would express this appreciation specifically and personally. The results were dramatic. Employee turnover in Martha's department dropped to nearly zero. Productivity increased significantly. But the most remarkable change was in the atmosphere of the workplace itself. People began taking greater pride in their work, supporting each other more generously, and taking initiative to solve problems without being asked. They had begun to see themselves as important contributors to something meaningful. I learned that making others feel important isn't about grand gestures or elaborate recognition programs. It's about the daily practice of noticing people's efforts, acknowledging their contributions, and treating them as valuable human beings rather than just functional roles. It's about remembering that behind every job title is a person with hopes, dreams, and a fundamental need to matter. The most effective leaders I've known have mastered the art of making everyone around them feel like their most important asset. They understand that when people feel genuinely valued and appreciated, they naturally want to justify that appreciation by performing at their highest level. I learned the power of admitting mistakes in the most embarrassing way possible, in front of 200 business leaders at a conference in Chicago. I was delivering what I thought was a brilliant presentation about leadership principles when I made a factual error about a well-known company's history. Halfway through my talk, I noticed several people in the audience whispering to each other and shaking their heads. My heart sank as I realized I had gotten my facts completely wrong. In that moment, I faced a choice that every leader encounters. I could try to cover up my mistake, deflect responsibility, or double down on my incorrect information. Instead, I stopped mid-sentence and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to correct something I just told you. I was completely wrong about those dates, and I apologize for the confusion. Let me give you the accurate information instead." What happened next surprised me completely. Instead of losing credibility, I gained it. The audience actually seemed more engaged and attentive after my admission. During the break, several executives approached me to thank me for my honesty. One man said, "Mr. Carnegie, that took real courage. It made everything else you said more believable, because we know you're willing to tell us the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." This experience revolutionized my understanding of leadership authenticity. I had always believed that leaders needed to project an image of infallibility, that admitting mistakes would undermine authority and respect. But I discovered the opposite was true. When leaders acknowledge their errors quickly and honestly, they demonstrate strength, not weakness. They show that they're secure enough in themselves to put truth above ego. I began teaching this principle to the executives and managers I worked with, and the results were consistently powerful. When leaders admitted their mistakes promptly, several important things happened. First, it created psychological safety. For their teams, if the leader could admit being wrong, then everyone else felt safer about acknowledging their own errors and learning from them. Second, it built trust because people knew their leader was honest and wouldn't try to blame others for problems. Third, it encouraged faster problem solving because energy wasn't wasted on cover-ups or finger-pointing. I worked with a factory supervisor named Robert Chen, who transformed his entire department by embracing this principle. Robert had been struggling with quality control issues and had initially tried to blame the problems on inadequate training, faulty equipment, and worker carelessness. When he finally admitted to his manager and his team that he had made poor decisions in prioritizing speed over quality, everything changed. His workers, who had been defensive and resistant, suddenly became collaborative partners in solving the quality problems. They began bringing him suggestions and pointing out potential issues before they became major problems. His manager, instead of viewing him as someone who made excuses, began seeing him as someone who could be trusted with greater responsibility. The key insight I discovered is that admitting mistakes actually enhances, rather than diminishes, leadership authority. When leaders take responsibility for their errors, they demonstrate the kind of integrity and character that makes people want to follow them. They model the behavior they want to see in their organization: accountability, honesty, and a commitment to continuous improvement over protecting one's image. This principle requires tremendous courage because it goes against our natural instinct to defend ourselves and preserve our reputation. But I've learned that the leaders who have the courage to be vulnerable about their mistakes are the ones who ultimately earn the deepest respect and loyalty from those they lead. The most profound leadership transformation I ever witnessed occurred when I worked with Thomas Morrison, a sales manager whose team was consistently underperforming despite his tireless efforts to motivate them. Thomas was a dedicated leader who worked longer hours than anyone else, constantly provided detailed instructions, and regularly gave passionate speeches about the importance of meeting quotas. Yet his team remained unmotivated and their sales numbers continued to disappoint. When I observed Thomas in action, I quickly identified the problem. He was managing through commands rather than leading through questions. Every interaction with his team followed the same pattern. Thomas would identify a problem, determine the solution, and then tell his salespeople exactly what to do. While his solutions were usually correct, his approach was creating passive, dependent team members who waited for instructions rather than thinking for themselves. I suggested that Thomas try a radically different approach for 1 month. Instead of giving orders and solutions, he would ask questions and guide his team to discover answers for themselves. Thomas was skeptical. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, "I don't have time for guessing games. These people need clear direction, not riddles." But he agreed to experiment with my suggestion. The transformation began with a struggling salesperson named Janet, who hadn't made her quota in 3 months. Previously, Thomas would have lectured her about work ethic and given her a detailed plan for improvement. Instead, he asked her a simple question. "Janet, what do you think might be causing your sales challenges?" This question opened up a conversation that revealed Janet had been focusing on the wrong type of prospects and was struggling with objection handling in a specific area. Rather than immediately providing solutions, Thomas continued asking questions. "What type of prospects do you think might be more receptive to our services? When customers raise that particular objection, what do you think they're really concerned about? What approaches have you seen other successful salespeople use in similar situations?" Through this questioning process, Janet began developing her own insights and solutions. The results were remarkable. Within 2 weeks, Janet's performance began improving dramatically. But more importantly, she had developed problem-solving skills and confidence that made her a stronger salesperson overall. She was no longer dependent on Thomas for answers because she had learned to think through challenges systematically. Thomas began applying this questioning approach with his entire team. Instead of conducting meetings where he announced new policies and procedures, he facilitated discussions where team members identified challenges and developed solutions together. Instead of telling underperformers what they were doing wrong, he asked questions that helped them recognize areas for improvement themselves. The impact on team performance was extraordinary. Sales increased by 40% within 6 months, but the real transformation was in the team's attitude and initiative. Team members began bringing Thomas problems along with proposed solutions. They started helping each other improve instead of competing destructively. They took ownership of their results because they had participated in creating the strategies they were implementing. I learned that questions are more powerful than commands because they engage people's minds rather than just demanding compliance. When we ask the right questions, we help people think through situations more thoroughly than they might on their own. We encourage them to consider multiple perspectives and develop deeper understanding. Most importantly, we help them reach conclusions that they own because they discovered them themselves. The art of leadership through questioning requires patience and skill. The questions must be genuine, not leading or manipulative. They should help people explore possibilities rather than trap them into predetermined answers. And leaders must be prepared to accept solutions that might be different from what they would have chosen themselves. I learned one of the most important lessons about preserving human dignity through a painful mistake I made early in my consulting career. I was working with a company where a department head named George Williams had implemented a policy that was clearly ineffective and causing problems throughout the organization. Instead of addressing the issue privately and diplomatically, I criticized his decision in front of his peers during a management meeting, pointing out its flaws and suggesting a better approach. While my analysis was correct and my alternative solution was sound, the way I handled the situation was devastating. George's face turned red, his shoulders slumped, and I could see that I had humiliated him in front of his colleagues. Although he grudgingly agreed to change the policy, his attitude toward me and toward implementing any improvements became resistant and hostile. I had won the argument but lost the person, and with him I lost any chance of creating positive change in his department. That experience taught me that how we correct people is often more important than being right. When we damage someone's dignity in the process of fixing a problem, we create emotional wounds that can destroy relationships and undermine future cooperation. People will forgive mistakes in judgment, but they rarely forgive attacks on their self-respect. I began studying leaders who were exceptionally skilled at correcting problems while preserving relationships. I noticed they had developed the art of helping people save face even when changes needed to be made. They understood that people's dignity and self-esteem are precious and fragile, and that protecting these qualities is essential to maintaining trust and cooperation. One master of this approach was Eleanor Roosevelt, whom I had the privilege of observing during several public events. When she needed to address mistakes or suggest improvements, she had a remarkable ability to do so in ways that actually enhanced rather than diminished the other person's standing. She would often begin by acknowledging what was working well before addressing what needed to change. She would frame corrections as opportunities for growth rather than failures to be ashamed of. I began teaching this principle by helping leaders develop what I called diplomatic correction techniques. Instead of saying, "You're wrong about this," they learned to say, "I wonder if we might consider another approach." Instead of, "This policy isn't working," they would say, "What if we tried some modifications to make this even more effective?" The goal was to address problems while allowing people to maintain their dignity and even take credit for improvements. I worked with a plant manager named Sarah Chen, who mastered this approach beautifully. When she needed to correct a supervisor's mistake, she would meet with him privately and say something like, "I know you've been working hard on this project, and I have some thoughts that might help us get even better results. What would you think about trying this approach?" This allowed the supervisor to save face while still addressing the problem effectively. The remarkable thing about letting others save face is that it often leads to better outcomes than direct confrontation. When people don't feel defensive, they're more open to feedback and more willing to make changes. They become partners in solving problems rather than opponents defending their territory. This principle requires genuine respect for others' dignity and a willingness to be generous with credit. It means sometimes allowing others to present solutions as their own ideas, even when we contributed significantly to developing them. It means correcting privately and praising publicly. Most importantly, it means remembering that preserving relationships is usually more valuable than proving we're right. The power of praising improvement, no matter how small, became clear to me through my work with a struggling telephone operator named Mary Sullivan. Mary worked for a large company where customer service had become a serious problem. Complaints were mounting, and management was considering drastic measures to improve performance. Most supervisors focused their attention on the operators who were failing, constantly pointing out their mistakes and demanding better performance. When I suggested they try a different approach with Mary, who had been receiving frequent criticism for her abrupt manner with customers, the supervisor was skeptical. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, "Mary has been rude to customers for months. Praise isn't going to fix that kind of attitude problem." But I convinced him to try an experiment for just 2 weeks. Instead of waiting for Mary to transform completely, we began looking for any improvement, however slight. On the first day, Mary handled one customer call with noticeably more patience than usual. Her supervisor immediately acknowledged this. "Mary, I noticed how patiently you worked with Mrs. Johnson today. That kind of service really makes a difference for our customers." Mary seemed surprised by the positive attention, but clearly pleased over. The next few days we continued this approach. When Mary remembered to use a customer's name during a call, we acknowledged it. When she went slightly out of her way to help someone find information, we noticed and commented. When she maintained her composure during a difficult conversation, we recognized that improvement, too. We weren't praising mediocrity or ignoring problems. We were acknowledging every step in the right direction. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, Mary had become one of the most improved operators in the department. But more importantly, she had begun to see herself differently. Instead of thinking of herself as someone who was constantly failing to meet expectations, she began to think of herself as someone who was capable of providing excellent customer service. This shift in self-perception led to continued improvement that went far beyond our initial expectations. I discovered that praise works like sunlight on plants. It encourages growth and development in ways that criticism simply cannot. When we acknowledge improvement, we're not just recognizing what someone has done, we're reinforcing the behavior we want to see more of. We're helping people build confidence in their ability to grow and change. This principle revolutionized how I approached developing others. I began teaching leaders to become what I called improvement detectives, people who actively looked for progress to acknowledge. This didn't mean lowering standards or accepting poor performance. It meant recognizing that lasting change happens gradually, and each step forward deserves recognition. I worked with a factory foreman named Robert Martinez who implemented this approach with his entire team. Instead of focusing only on problems and defects, he began tracking and acknowledging improvements in safety practices, quality measures, and teamwork. He would publicly recognize workers who suggested process improvements, helped train new employees, or went extra effort to solve problems. The impact on productivity and morale was extraordinary. Workers began taking more initiative because they knew their efforts would be noticed and appreciated. They started helping each other improve because the culture rewarded progress rather than just punishing mistakes. Most importantly, people began to believe in their own capacity for growth and excellence. The key insight is that people tend to live up to the expectations we express through our attention and recognition. When we consistently notice and praise improvement, we communicate our belief that the person is capable of continued growth. This belief becomes a powerful motivating force that encourages people to keep striving for higher levels of performance. Effective. Praise must be specific, timely, and genuine. It should focus on the behavior or improvement rather than general character traits, and it should be delivered as close to the improvement as possible. Most importantly, it must be sincere. People can detect fake praise immediately, and insincere recognition can actually be demotivating. I discovered the transformative power of giving people a reputation to live up to through a young man named David Chen, who was on the verge of being fired from his position as a junior accountant. David's supervisor had repeatedly complained about his careless errors, missed deadlines, and general lack of attention to detail. When I was called in to consult on the situation, everyone expected me to help manage David out of the organization. Instead, I suggested we try a different approach. After reviewing David's work more carefully, I noticed that despite his problems with routine tasks, he had occasionally demonstrated flashes of analytical brilliance that his supervisor had overlooked. When David did focus completely on a project, his insights were often more sophisticated than those of his more experienced colleagues. The problem wasn't ability, it was confidence and motivation. I arranged a meeting with David where, instead of discussing his deficiencies, I spoke about the potential I saw in him. "David," I said, "I've been reviewing your work, and I see the mind of a natural financial analyst. Your approach to the Peterson account analysis showed real strategic thinking. I believe you have the capability to become one of the most valuable members of this department." David looked shocked. Clearly, no one had ever spoken to him this way about his professional potential. But I didn't stop there. I began treating David as if he were already the capable analyst I believed he could become. I gave him more challenging assignments that required the analytical skills I had noticed. I introduced him to colleagues as our sharp young analyst and publicly acknowledged his insights during meetings. Most importantly, I consistently expressed confidence in his abilities. Even when he made mistakes, the transformation was remarkable but not immediate. At first, David seemed almost confused by the positive expectations. He had become so accustomed to being seen as incompetent that he didn't know how to respond to being treated as capable. But gradually, he began to rise to meet the reputation I was giving him. His attention to detail improved because he didn't want to disappoint someone who believed in him. His confidence grew because he started to see himself through my eyes rather than through the lens of his past failures. Within 6 months, David had become exactly what I had said he was, one of the most valuable analysts in the department. But the real revelation was understanding how powerful our expectations can be in shaping others' performance. When we consistently treat people as if they possess certain qualities, they often develop those qualities to justify our confidence in them. This principle became central to my approach to developing leaders. Instead of focusing on people's current limitations, I learned to identify their potential strengths and consistently speak to those strengths as if they were already fully developed. I would tell emerging leaders, "You have natural leadership instincts," or "I can see you're someone who really cares about developing others," or "You have the kind of integrity that makes people want to follow you." The key is that these statements must be based on genuine observation of potential, not empty flattery. People can sense when praise is authentic versus when it's manipulative. But when we sincerely recognize qualities that are emerging or dormant, and we consistently speak to those qualities, we help people develop confidence in their ability to grow into our expectations. I worked with a retail manager named Patricia Williams who used this approach to transform her entire team. Instead of labeling struggling employees as problem workers, she began identifying their strengths and consistently referring to them in terms of their potential. She would say things like, "I know you're naturally good with customers," or "You have excellent problem-solving abilities," or "I can count on your attention to detail." The results were extraordinary. Employees began living up to the positive reputations she gave them, and the entire store's performance improved dramatically. People started taking pride in the qualities she recognized in them and worked harder to justify her confidence. The profound impact of encouragement became clear to me through my work with Helen Morrison, a middle-aged secretary who had been passed over for promotion 3 times and was beginning to believe she lacked the ability to advance in her career. Helen was competent at her current role, but had lost confidence in her potential for growth. Her supervisor described her as reliable, but not leadership material, and Helen had begun to accept this assessment of her capabilities. When I was brought in to help with the company's leadership development program, I noticed Helen's thoughtful questions during our sessions and her natural ability to help other participants think through challenges. Despite her quiet demeanor, she possessed insights about organizational dynamics that surpassed many of the managers in the room. I realized that Helen didn't lack leadership potential. She lacked encouragement and belief in herself. I began what I called an encouragement campaign with Helen. After each training session, I would find something specific to encourage. "Helen, your question about communication barriers showed real strategic thinking," or "I noticed how you helped Jennifer work through that problem. You have natural coaching instincts," or Your suggestion about the workflow improvement could save this company significant time and money." At first, Helen seemed uncomfortable with this positive attention. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked and didn't know how to respond to encouragement. But I persisted, always being specific and genuine in my observations. I wasn't offering empty praise. I was pointing out real strengths and contributions that others had failed to notice or acknowledge. The transformation began slowly. Helen started participating more actively in discussions. She began offering suggestions during meetings instead of keeping her ideas to herself. Most importantly, she started believing in her own capabilities. When a supervisory position opened up 6 months later, Helen applied and was selected over several other candidates, including some who had previously been considered more promising. This experience taught me that encouragement is like oxygen for human potential. Without it, people's abilities suffocate and die. With it, they flourish in ways that can surprise everyone, including themselves. I realized that many people who appear to lack talent or motivation are actually suffering from a lack of encouragement. They've been criticized so much and encouraged so little that they've lost faith in their ability to grow and contribute. I began teaching leaders to become what I called professional encouragers. This meant making encouragement a deliberate daily practice, not just something that happened occasionally when someone achieved outstanding results. It meant looking for opportunities to acknowledge effort, progress, and potential, not just finished accomplishments. One leader who mastered this approach was James Patterson, a plant manager who inherited a demoralized workforce that had suffered through years of criticism and blame. Instead of focusing on what was wrong, James began systematically encouraging what was right. He would walk through the plant daily, looking for reasons to offer encouragement, thanking someone for staying focused during a difficult task, acknowledging a worker's suggestion for improvement, or recognizing someone's helpful attitude toward a new employee. The change in plant culture was dramatic. Within a year, productivity had increased substantially, but more importantly, workers began taking initiative to solve problems and improve processes. They started encouraging each other, creating a positive cycle that transformed the entire workplace atmosphere. Employee turnover dropped to almost zero, and the plant became a model for other facilities in the company. The key to effective encouragement is that it must be sincere, specific, and frequent. Generic praise like "good job" has little impact because it doesn't tell people what they did well or why it mattered. But specific encouragement like "I appreciated how patiently you worked with that frustrated customer," that kind of service builds loyalty, gives people clear feedback about behaviors worth repeating. I learned that encouragement works best when it focuses on effort and improvement rather than just natural talent. When we encourage people's hard work and progress, we reinforce the idea that growth is possible through dedication and practice. The ultimate test of leadership came when I worked with Margaret Foster, a volunteer coordinator for a large charitable organization who was struggling to motivate people to take on challenging assignments. Margaret had a critical project that required volunteers to work long hours in difficult conditions, helping families affected by a natural disaster. Despite the importance of the work, she was having trouble finding people willing to commit to the demanding schedule. Margaret's initial approach was to emphasize duty and obligation. She would tell potential volunteers about how much the organization needed them and how important it was for them to step up during this crisis. While some people responded to this appeal, many others politely declined or made minimal commitments. Margaret was frustrated and couldn't understand why people weren't more willing to help with such important work. When I observed Margaret's recruitment efforts, I realized she was focusing on what she needed rather than on what would motivate others to want to participate. I suggested she try a completely different approach. Instead of emphasizing obligation, she should help people see how the work aligned with their own interests, values, and desires for personal fulfillment. Margaret began by really listening to potential volunteers to understand what mattered to them personally. She discovered that some people were motivated by the opportunity to develop new skills. Others wanted to make meaningful connections with their community, and still others were looking for ways to involve their families in service activities. Armed with these insights, she completely changed how she presented the volunteer opportunity. To someone who mentioned wanting to develop leadership skills, she would say, "This project would give you incredible experience in crisis management and team coordination, exactly the kind of skills that could advance your career." To a parent who talked about wanting to teach their children about compassion, she would say, "This would be a powerful way to show your kids how they can make a real difference in people's lives." To someone who felt isolated in their community, she would emphasize the deep friendships that often formed among volunteers working together toward a common cause. The transformation in response was remarkable. Instead of reluctantly accepting assignments out of guilt or obligation, people began enthusiastically signing up because they could see how the work would benefit them personally while helping others. More importantly, these volunteers performed at a much higher level because they were internally motivated rather than externally pressured. This experience taught me that the highest form of leadership isn't getting people to do what you want, it's helping them want to do what needs to be done. When we can align organizational needs with individual motivations, we create a powerful synergy where people are glad to contribute their best efforts. I began teaching leaders to become what I called motivation translators. This meant learning to present requests and assignments in terms of how they would benefit the other person, not just how they would serve organizational needs. It required taking time to understand what motivates each individual and then connecting those motivations to the work that needs to be accomplished. A manufacturing supervisor named Carlos Rodriguez mastered this approach beautifully. When he needed someone to take on additional quality control responsibilities, instead of simply assigning the task, he would think about who might benefit from the opportunity. He might approach someone who had expressed interest in advancement and say, "I have an opportunity that could really showcase your attention to detail and help you build the kind of experience our managers value." The results were consistently positive. People performed better when they felt the work served their own interests as well as the company's needs. They took more ownership of outcomes because they had chosen to participate rather than being forced. To comply, this principle requires patience and genuine interest in others' well-being. It means sometimes saying no to requests that can't be aligned with people's legitimate interests. But when we can honestly show people how contributing to our goals also serves their own aspirations, we create the kind of voluntary cooperation that makes organizations thrive. The true measure of leadership reveals itself during times of crisis and uncertainty, a lesson I learned while working with Franklin Manufacturing during the economic downturn of 1932. The company was facing potential bankruptcy. Massive layoffs loomed, and employee morale had plummeted to dangerous levels. The owner, William Franklin, had asked me to help him communicate the dire situation to his workforce and somehow maintain their cooperation during the painful changes ahead. When I arrived at the plant, I found a workforce paralyzed by fear and rumors. Production had slowed because workers were spending more time worrying about their futures than focusing on their tasks. Some of the best employees were already looking for other jobs, and those who remained were bitter and resistant to any suggestions for improvement. The atmosphere was toxic, and it seemed like the company was spiraling toward collapse. William's initial instinct was to minimize the crisis, hoping to maintain morale by downplaying the severity of the situation. But I convinced him that during times of uncertainty, people need truth more than false reassurance. We decided to hold an all-hands meeting where William would be completely honest about the company's challenges while also outlining a clear plan for survival and recovery. The meeting was one of the most powerful demonstrations of crisis leadership I have ever witnessed. William stood before his entire workforce and said, I'm not going to lie to you about how serious our situation is. We're facing the biggest challenge in our company's history, and I need your help to get through it." He then laid out the financials, realities, the market conditions, and the difficult decisions that would need to be made. But instead of ending with despair, William shifted to possibility. He explained his vision for how the company could emerge stronger from this crisis. He outlined specific steps they would take to reduce costs, improve efficiency, and position themselves for recovery. Most importantly, he asked for their ideas and promised that every suggestion would be seriously considered. He made it clear that this was not just his fight, it was their fight together. The response surprised everyone, including me. Instead of panic or mass resignations, the workforce rallied around their leader. Workers began volunteering for temporary pay cuts to avoid layoffs. They submitted dozens of cost-saving suggestions that management had never considered. Departments began working together more collaboratively than ever before because they understood that their survival depended on collective effort. What I observed during this crisis taught me invaluable lessons about leadership during difficult times. First, people can handle the truth, even when it's painful, but they cannot handle uncertainty and deception. When leaders are honest about challenges while also providing clear direction, they build rather than destroy trust. Second, crisis creates opportunity for deeper engagement because people understand that their contributions really matter. I learned that effective crisis leadership requires what I call realistic optimism, the ability to acknowledge genuine problems while maintaining confidence in the possibility of solutions. This means being honest about current realities while painting a compelling picture of what's possible if everyone works together toward common goals. During that difficult period, I also discovered that crisis reveals people's true leadership potential. Several workers who had never shown particular initiative stepped forward to take on additional responsibilities. A young machinist named Robert Chen organized volunteer weekend work sessions to complete urgent orders. A secretary named Maria Santos created a communication system that kept everyone informed about recovery progress. Crisis had awakened leadership qualities that might never have emerged under normal circumstances. The company not only survived, but eventually thrived, becoming more efficient and resilient than it had been before the crisis. But the real transformation was in the culture. Employees had learned they could trust their leadership to tell them the truth and include them in finding solutions. They had discovered their own capacity to rise to extraordinary challenges when their contributions were needed and valued. This experience taught me that the leaders who emerge strongest from crisis are those who combine honest communication with unwavering commitment to their people's well-being. They understand that while they cannot control external circumstances, they can control how they respond and how they inspire others to respond. The most profound moment in my understanding of leadership legacy came through a letter I received from a man named Joseph Miller, 15 years after I had worked with his company. Joseph wrote to tell me that the leadership principles I had taught him had not only transformed his career, but had shaped how he raised his children and contributed to his community. What struck me most was his closing line. "Mr. Carnegie, the greatest gift you gave me wasn't knowledge. It was showing me how to develop other leaders." This letter made me realize that true leadership isn't measured by what we accomplish ourselves, but by what we enable others to accomplish long after we're gone. The most successful leaders I had worked with weren't those who made themselves indispensable, but those who made themselves unnecessary by developing the leadership capabilities of everyone around them. I began studying leaders who had built lasting legacies, and I discovered a common pattern. They all understood that their primary responsibility wasn't to be the smartest person in the room or to solve every problem personally. Instead, they saw their role as identifying, developing, and empowering other leaders. They measured their success not by their individual achievements, but by the collective success of the people they had influenced. One of the best examples of this approach was a department head named Catherine Walsh, who led a team of 30 employees in a large insurance company. When Catherine was promoted to her leadership role, the department was struggling with high turnover, low morale, and mediocre performance. Rather than trying to micromanage improvements, Catherine focused on identifying and developing the leadership potential within her existing team. She began by observing her employees carefully, looking for signs of natural leadership ability. Who did others turn to for advice? Who took initiative during challenging situations? Who showed genuine concern for their colleagues' success? She identified 5 individuals who demonstrated various aspects of leadership potential, even though none of them held formal supervisory roles. Catherine then began what she called her leadership development laboratory. She started giving these emerging leaders small opportunities to practice leadership skills, leading project teams, mentoring new employees, representing the department in cross-functional meetings. Most importantly, she coached them through these experiences, helping them learn from both successes and failures. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 years, 4 of these individuals had been promoted to supervisory roles within the company, and the 5th had started his own successful business. But the real impact was on the department's culture. Because Catherine had focused on developing leaders rather than followers, the entire team had become more proactive, more collaborative, and more committed to excellence. What impressed me most about Catherine's approach was her long-term thinking. She knew that some of the people she was developing would eventually leave her department or even the company, but she understood that her legacy would be measured by their continued success wherever they went. She was building a network of leaders who would carry forward the principles and values she had taught them. This experience taught me that leadership legacy is created through what I call multiplication leadership, the practice of developing other leaders who will develop still more leaders. It's about creating a ripple effect of positive influence that extends far beyond our direct reach and continues long after our own involvement ends. I learned that building this kind of legacy requires a fundamental shift in mindset. Instead of asking, "How can I achieve my goals?" legacy-minded leaders ask, "How can I help others achieve their goals?" Instead of hoarding knowledge and opportunities, they share them generously. Instead of building their own reputations, they focus on building others' capabilities. The measurement of leadership legacy isn't found in titles, salaries, or personal achievements. It's found in the success of the people we've influenced, the more positive changes they create in their own spheres of influence, and the leaders they develop in turn. When we focus on building this kind of legacy, we discover that our impact can literally continue for generations. The leaders who understand this principle find deep satisfaction in watching others succeed and knowing they played a role in that success. They measure their worth not by how much they accomplish personally, but by how much they enable others to accomplish collectively. The most heartbreaking conversation I ever had about leadership was with a man named Richard Thompson, who had been promoted to vice president of a major corporation, only to be demoted 18 months later. Richard was brilliant, hardworking, and genuinely well-intentioned, but he had made critical mistakes that destroyed his effectiveness as a leader. His story taught me more about what not to do than dozens of success stories had taught me about what to do right. Richard's first mistake was believing that leadership meant having all the answers. When he was promoted, he felt enormous pressure to prove he deserved the position by demonstrating his expertise and competence. So whenever his team brought him problems, he would immediately provide solutions. When they asked questions, he would give detailed explanations. When they faced challenges, he would step in and handle the situations himself. What Richard didn't realize was that his helpfulness was actually undermining his team's confidence and development. His employees gradually stopped thinking for themselves because they knew Richard would solve their problems for them. They became passive and dependent, waiting for direction instead of taking initiative. Ironically, Richard's expertise had made his team less capable rather than more capable. The second mistake Richard made was trying to be liked by everyone rather than respected for making difficult decisions. When conflicts arose within his team, he would avoid addressing them directly, hoping they would resolve themselves. When poor performers needed to be corrected, he would hint at problems rather than having honest conversations. When unpopular but necessary changes needed to be implemented, he would delay or water down his decisions to minimize resistance. This approach backfired completely. His best performers became frustrated with his failure to address obvious problems. His poor performers continued their problematic behavior because they faced no real consequences. The team lost respect for Richard because they saw him as weak and indecisive, not caring and supportive as he had intended. Richard's third critical mistake was taking all the credit when things went well and accepting all the blame when things went poorly. He thought this demonstrated strong leadership, but it actually had the opposite effect. When his team succeeded, they felt unappreciated because Richard presented their achievements as his own. When failures occurred, they felt no ownership or responsibility for improvement because Richard had shouldered all the accountability. The final mistake that led to Richard's downfall was his failure to listen to feedback about his leadership style. Multiple team members had tried to suggest different approaches, but Richard dismissed their concerns because he was convinced his intentions were good. His boss had hinted that changes were needed, but Richard interpreted this as unfair criticism rather than valuable guidance. What made Richard's situation so tragic was that all his mistakes came from positive intentions. He wanted to be helpful, liked, protective of his team, and accountable for results. But he had confused good intentions with effective leadership. He learned the hard way that leadership isn't about being the smartest, most popular, or most self-sacrificing person. It's about helping others become their best selves and achieve collective success. Through Richard's experience and many others like it, I identified the most common leadership failures. The first is micromanagement disguised as helpfulness, solving problems for people instead of helping them develop problem-solving skills. The second is conflict avoidance disguised as kindness, failing to address issues because we don't want to upset people. The third is credit hoarding disguised as accountability, taking responsibility in ways that actually diminish others' ownership and growth. The most dangerous leadership mistake is believing that good intentions are enough. Every failed leader I've encountered had positive intentions, but they lacked the skills and understanding to translate those intentions into effective actions. Leadership requires not just good motives, but also emotional intelligence, communication skills, and the wisdom to know when to step in and when to step back. The key to avoiding these mistakes is developing genuine humility, the recognition that leadership is about serving others' success rather than demonstrating our own competence. When we approach leadership with this mindset, we're much more likely to make decisions that truly benefit our teams and organizations rather than just making ourselves feel better about our performance as leaders. After decades of studying and teaching leadership, I've learned that developing your natural leadership abilities requires the same systematic approach you would use to master any other skill. It's not enough to understand the principles intellectually. You must practice them deliberately and consistently until they become second nature. Let me share with you the development plan that has helped thousands of people unlock their leadership potential. The first step is honest self-assessment. Take time to evaluate your current leadership abilities against the 10 principles we've discussed. Where do you genuinely show interest in others? How well do you listen compared to how much you speak? When did you last admit a mistake quickly and openly? Are you more comfortable giving orders or asking questions? This assessment isn't about judging yourself harshly. It's about identifying your starting point so you can measure progress. I recommend what I call the leadership audit approach. For 1 week, pay attention to every interaction you have with others, whether at work, at home, or in your community. Notice when you make people feel important versus when you might diminish them. Observe whether you encourage improvement or focus mainly on problems. Track how often you help others save face versus how often you might embarrass them, even unintentionally. The second step is selecting one principle to focus on intensively for 30 days. Don't try to improve everything at once. That leads to superficial change rather than deep development. Choose the principle that feels most challenging or that you believe would have the greatest impact on your relationships and effectiveness. If you struggle with listening, commit to asking more questions and talking less. If you rarely acknowledge others' contributions, focus on finding genuine reasons to appreciate people daily. During this 30-day period, practice your chosen principle every day with deliberate intention. Set specific goals. I will ask at least 3 meaningful questions in today's team meeting, or I will find something genuine to appreciate about each person I work with today, or I will look for one improvement to acknowledge in each team member this week. The key is consistent, focused practice rather than occasional random efforts. Keep a simple leadership journal during this period. Each evening, write briefly about how you practiced your chosen principle that day. What worked well? What felt uncomfortable? How did people respond? What did you learn about yourself and others? This reflection process helps embed the learning and reveals insights you might otherwise miss. The third step is seeking feedback from people who interact with you regularly. This requires courage because feedback isn't always comfortable, but it's essential for growth. Ask specific questions. How could I be a better listener in our meetings? Or, what could I do to make you feel more valued and appreciated? Or, when have you seen me handle situations well? And when could I have done better? I found that most people are surprisingly willing to give honest, helpful feedback when they see you're genuinely committed to improvement. They appreciate being asked for their input, and they often become invested in supporting your development. When they see you taking their suggestions seriously, the fourth step is gradually expanding your practice. After 30 days of focused work on one principle, add a second principle, while maintaining your progress on the first. Continue this process until you're consistently practicing all 10 principles as natural habits rather than conscious efforts. Remember that leadership development is a lifelong journey, not a destination. Even after decades of studying and teaching these principles, I continue to discover new applications and deeper levels of understanding. The goal isn't perfection, it's continuous improvement and genuine service to others' success. The most successful leaders I've known treat their development with the same seriousness they bring to other important aspects of their lives. They invest time daily in practicing leadership skills, just as athletes practice their sport or musicians practice their instruments. They understand that leadership ability grows through consistent, intentional effort over time. Your leadership development plan should be personal and practical. Focus on real situations where you can practice, with real people who matter to you. Start where you are, with what you have, and take one small step forward each day. The compound effect of this consistent effort will transform not only your leadership abilities, but your entire approach to human relationships. As I look back over my decades of studying human nature and leadership, I'm struck by one profound truth. Every person I've ever met possessed natural leadership abilities, though most never recognized or developed them. The shy farm boy who was terrified to speak in public, the factory worker who thought he was just following orders, the secretary who believed she lacked leadership material, all of them had within themselves the capacity to influence others positively and create meaningful change. The leader you were born to be isn't some idealized version of yourself that requires a complete personality transformation. It's the authentic you, equipped with the skills and understanding to bring out the best in others and serve something larger than your own interests. It's you choosing to see people's potential rather than their limitations. It's you deciding to listen more than you speak, to encourage more than you criticize, to lift others up rather than tear them down. I've learned that leadership isn't about having a commanding presence or being the most charismatic person in the room. Some of the most effective leaders I've known were quiet, thoughtful individuals who influenced others through genuine care and consistent example. What made them leaders wasn't their personality type, it was their commitment to helping others succeed and their willingness to serve a purpose beyond themselves. The moment you decide to take genuine interest in someone else's welfare, you begin to lead. When you choose to really listen to a colleague's concerns, you're exercising leadership. When you acknowledge someone's improvement, no matter how small, you're leading them toward greater confidence and capability. When you ask questions that help people think through problems instead of simply giving them answers, you're developing their leadership potential. Every day presents you with countless opportunities to practice these principles. In your family, you can model the kind of character and values you want to see. At work, you can help colleagues feel valued and important regardless of your official title or position. In your community, you can contribute to positive change by encouraging others and building bridges between different perspectives. The responsibility of leadership isn't something you can avoid by choosing not to pursue formal leadership positions. Whether you recognize it or not, you influence others through your words, actions, and attitudes. The question isn't whether you'll influence people, it's whether that influence will be positive or negative, whether it will help others grow or hold them back. I want you to understand that the world needs the unique leadership contribution that only you can make. Your particular combination of experiences, insights, and caring gives you the ability to reach and influence people that others might not be able to touch. There are people in your life right now who could benefit from your encouragement, your genuine interest, your belief in their potential. The principles I've shared with you aren't just techniques for managing others or advancing your career. They're ways of living that honor the dignity and potential in every human being. When you practice these principles consistently, you're not just becoming a better leader, you're becoming a better person and helping create a better world. The time to begin is now. You don't need to wait for a promotion, a formal leadership role, or perfect confidence in your abilities. You can start today by choosing to see the people around you through the lens of their potential rather than their problems. You can begin this moment by deciding to be genuinely interested in someone else's success, by listening with the intent to understand, by looking for reasons to encourage and appreciate. The leader you were born to be is waiting for you to recognize and claim that identity. It's time to step into the full expression of your natural leadership abilities and begin the rewarding journey of helping others discover theirs. Your leadership legacy starts with your very next interaction. Make it count.